Good morning, everyone. Please come in quickly if you can and take your seats because we have a jam-packed first session. So for those of you who haven't met me yet, I'm Sanchia Aranda. I'm the President of UACC for the next couple of days before I hand over to Princess Dina Murad. It is, though, an absolute pleasure to be here with you this morning for this first plenary session. We spend a lot of time thinking about the plenaries and really about topics that will engage our audience. And this particular plenary focuses on what's next after the UN high-level meeting on non-communicable diseases that was held last week in New York. And as you know, increasingly around the globe, cancer has been positioned as part of the NCD movement, and that UACC was one of the founders of the NCD Alliance, and we're delighted to put this kind of focus onto the session. Later on, so today we'll be having two keynote presentations, one by Christopher Wild from IARC and the other from Katie Dain from the NCD Alliance, and we bring apologies from Sanchia, who has been unable to join us today. Later on, we will also have a panel discussion where another two speakers will join our keynotes, and we'll also have some question and answer time for you as well. Later on in the day, the speakers will be holding an informal Q&A session at 3:20 in the Meet-In Cafe, which is right down the other end of the building if you haven't found it yet, but on this level. So it's my absolute pleasure now to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Christopher Wild, who is the director of IARC. Chris did his postdoc also at IARC before going back there 10 years ago as director, and we like to think of him being here at UACC as his swan song, given that he is finishing at IARC at the end of the year. Chris has been a friend of UACC for a long time, and we're delighted that he's chosen this occasion to talk to us about the Global Burden of Cancer 2018 and its implications for cancer prevention and control. The International Agency for Research on Cancer is a WHO agency, which sometimes people don't make that connection, but it is a critical agency for us internationally in providing independent, evidence-based and reliable information on the causes of cancer and the global cancer burden. And having just had to cite that last week doing glyphosate media in Melbourne and Sydney was, I think, being able to call on that agency is really critical. So please join me in welcoming Chris to the stage.
Okay, well, thank you, Sanchia, for that very kind introduction, and it is a pleasure to be here at this UICC meeting. Actually, I also benefited from two UICC short-term training fellowships very early in my career, which were quite formative as well, so I owe a debt of gratitude to the organization, and it's always a pleasure to participate in the meetings. I'm going to speak about the global burden of cancer, the recent release of these data. Probably about 2/3 of the way through this presentation, you're going to be feeling quite depressed. But then the last third, you're going to start feeling uplifted and motivated again by what we can do. And that really plays into the next phase of the NCD agenda following the high-level meeting. And my last word of introduction is just around the production of the data, which I will show. I mean, essentially, these are the data produced by the team led by Dr. Freddie Bray, Jacques Ferlet, and Isabelle Surjamataram. So I'm presenting it because I'm director of the agency, but the work is really done by the colleagues that are listed on this title slide here. So let's start by making a very general point, but a crucial one actually, and that is that cancer registration is a foundation to cancer control. I mean, registries really are the platform on which everything else should be built. They help us describe the burden of cancer to understand the scale of the challenge, and that's what I'll speak about today. They give us clues, though, to understanding what's driving the patterns of cancer that I'll describe to you. That's how we generate new hypotheses about etiology. Of course, they inform us about what type of care we need to provide at national level for cancer patients and cancer survivors. And they also help us evaluate, in turn, interventions which we put in place to try to reduce the cancer burden. So registries really are essential to our work. And it's been one of the changes, I would say, over the last decade with this NCD agenda, that recognition of the importance of cancer registration has grown. A couple of examples here. The Global Monitoring Framework has one of the indicators as cancer registries. And forgive me for reading this out, but the cancer resolution that the World Health Assembly adopted last year says to collect high-quality population-based incidence and mortality data on cancer for all age groups by cancer type. And it goes on to talk about including measurements of inequalities through population-based cancer registries. I mean, I could not have written it better myself. I don't think Freddie could have written it better himself, and we were heavily involved in this discussion. So this is important, actually, this recognition. This just where do these fit? Where do these population-based cancer registries fit into a global surveillance network, framework? I mean, you can think about all the way from prevention through to palliative end-of-life care and the sort of data we need. You can think about healthy populations, therefore, new diagnosis, living with cancer and dying from cancer. And whilst we have population-based surveys to give us information on risk factors, so things like the WHO STEPS, the population-based cancer registries provide us the information on incidence and survival by cancer type, by stage. And then, of course, we also need mortality statistics, and these are mortality data, and these are also missing in many countries. So let me give you the GloboCan 2018 estimate. So what we looked at is incidence, mortality, and prevalence worldwide, 36 cancer types, 185 countries. I really encourage you to use the Global Cancer Observatory on the IARC website. All the data are available there, and it's a very flexible site, user-friendly. You can create your own presentations. There are country reports, there are tumor-specific reports. So that's all freely available, and there's also an open access peer-reviewed paper, which is shown here in the CA, a cancer journal for clinicians. So overall, our estimate is of 18.1 million new cancer cases in 2018. This just shows the burden split by region. It's interesting, in Europe, 23% of the total cancer cases occur there, with only 9% of the world's population. So a very big overrepresentation. But almost half the cancer cases occur in Asia, reflecting, of course, the large population base here. If you look at mortality, you see a little bit different picture. A larger proportion of the pie in Asia and Africa, and smaller in the Americas and Europe. And what that's reflecting is the prognosis of cancer patients in the different parts of the world. The outcome is quite different. And I think a number which is always little forgotten, actually, is the prevalence. I mean, so this is the number of people living within 5 years of a cancer diagnosis. And this group of cancer survivors is really essential also in terms of cancer planning at national level. And here you can see this expansion of the pie in the Americas and Europe compared to Africa and Asia. And again, that's because of the different outcomes following a cancer diagnosis geographically. So if we think about the total cancer burden among men and women in 2018, so 1 in 5 men worldwide develop cancer in their lifetime, 1 in 6 women. And if we then consider the number of people dying from cancer, 1 in 8 men, and 1 in 11 women globally. The top 5 cancers across both sexes are shown here. For incidence, lung is number 1, closely followed by breast cancer, colorectal, prostate, and stomach. If you look at mortality, what you see is stomach and liver cancers climbing up that league table because, again, of the very poor survival from those cancer sites, and breast cancer lower down. And in prevalence, breast at the top by some margin with colorectal, so the cancers that are treated more effectively, detected earlier generally, have a better prognosis, and lung cancer further down. Just notice, I'll return to this in the next slide, thyroid cancer in terms of prevalence being in the top 5. So now let's just break it down a little bit between men and women. Here's the pies on incidence and mortality of the different cancer sites. You can see this predominance of breast cancer that I mentioned. Around a quarter of all cancers in women worldwide are breast cancers. If you look at the incidence, you see also lung cancer climbing among women, and cervix in 4th place. And look at the thyroid cancer there, 5th most common cancer in women. There is an epidemic of overdiagnosis and overtreatment of thyroid cancer globally. And we see this even in registries in the emerging economies, thyroid cancer going up because of detection of very small papillary thyroid tumors that probably have no impact on the risk on mortality. Thyroid cancer mortality is extremely low and has remained so, but there is an epidemic of incident cancers with a very high morbidity associated. And in terms of mortality, breast cancer is first, but lung cancer very close behind, and cervix in 4th position. This is looking now at the most common cancer among women in each country in the world, and the world has become pink. I mean, breast cancer you see just covering the globe. Still cervical cancer in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, but this is a stunning visual representation of the importance of breast cancer worldwide. If we look at cancer deaths, the picture is a little different. The blue-colored countries here are where lung cancer is the major cause of cancer death among women. You can see the penetrance of tobacco smoke into this picture. And also look at the importance still of cervical cancer as a cause of mortality among women in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Southeast Asia and Latin America. Just want to spend a moment on trends, and this actually comes from cancer incidence in 5 continents, looking at incidence over time. And here are the data on the left-hand side on lung cancer incidence among men compared to women. So we're seeing this impact of the uptake of tobacco among women in many countries worldwide. In terms of breast cancer, we see that in some of the high-income countries there is a leveling off in incidence or even a drop, responding in some cases to the reduced use of hormone replacement therapy. But in many other countries in transition, breast cancer incidence rates are rising steeply. If we turn to men, picture is different, of course. Lung cancer, again, a predominant cause in both incidence and mortality. If you look at liver and stomach cancer, you see how they become so important in terms of cancer deaths. Again, the poor prognosis of these cancers and the fact that they're occurring often in countries which are least well able to treat such very aggressive tumors. This is the similar map to what I showed you before, but this time for men, the most common cancer in each country. And here you do see the effect of lung cancer and also how common prostate cancer is in many parts of the world, including in Africa. You know, I think there is a real opportunity to, we know almost nothing about the etiology of prostate cancer globally. And I wonder if there is not a major opportunity to glean some understanding about this tumor from these very high incidences in Africa where PSA-based screening has not yet fully penetrated into the national settings. And the most common cause of death, here the world turns blue, and it's a blue caused by excess, by tobacco usage. But again, cause of mortality, cancer mortality among men in sub-Saharan Africa is also dominated by prostate cancer. And you see liver cancer appearing, and in India and surrounding countries, the importance of lip and oral cavity with smokeless tobacco. So cancer is a disease of differences. You'll already have seen that while it's a global problem, it's very different by region and by country. This is a split of the incidence by Human Development Index from very high through to low. Again, you see these different patterns, the predominance of breast, colorectum, lung, prostate in the high and very high regions, and then the importance of cervical cancer, lip, oral cavity, and liver cancer in the medium and the low HDI color-coded countries here. Cancer is also a disease of inequality. I mean, this strikes you particularly if you have the opportunity, as I've had, to travel around the world and see just some of the differences in the cancer outcomes for a patient diagnosed with exactly the same disease, depending on the country. So I've given two illustrations here. On the left-hand side of the panel is female breast cancer. The blue bars are the incidence and the red the mortality. So you see the incidence varies markedly, but the mortality is rather similar. And that reflects the fact that a woman diagnosed with breast cancer in Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe has a very high chance now of survival. The picture is very different in parts of Asia and Africa. And the right-hand side of the panel shows some differences within countries. So the cancer statistics also allow us to get at some of these inequalities within populations. And this is an example of some collaborative work the agencies conducted showing the differences in cervical cancer incidence among indigenous and non-indigenous women in the same country. Study across New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the US. So these data also indicate if there are specific groups within a population that merit particular efforts in cancer control measures. Okay, that's the static picture, if you like. What about the projections going forward? And we've got this very clear evidence based on demographic changes and aging and growing population that this number of new cancer cases will grow from 18 million to 29.4 million in just 20 years' time. I mean, sometimes this can be said almost in a glib way, but imagine this is more than 10 million extra new cancer cases every year globally. I mean, this is a stunning figure, and we know this is coming. I mean, we have a responsibility to respond to this. And again, that's a... Does that mean I have to walk off? No. Because the positive part is yet to come, so I can't leave now. So I want to show you this is a global phenomenon as well in terms of the increase. Here are the number of new cancer cases by Human Development Index group. And this is the change that's anticipated over those 20 or so years. So you can see that the increases are across the board, and actually the percent increases are greatest in the countries that are least able to meet that challenge in terms of their cancer services. Okay, I just want to make one note, because I'm mixing here at times rates, incidence mortality rates per 100,000 with absolute numbers. So look at the left-hand panel. This is the success story. This is the impact of reducing tobacco consumption on lung cancer incidence trends in some high-income countries. And what I've done on the right-hand panel is focus on the UK. And there you see an extrapolation of that continued success in the line drawing. That's the incidence dropping. So that's meeting the targets that we have. And the bars are giving you the total number of new lung cancer cases among men in the UK per year. So you see the demographic effect is actually outweighing the decrease in rates and leaving us with more patients, even though the rates are being successfully brought down. So this is partly why cancer is becoming the leading cause of premature death and will be so during this century. And what I've shown here, just the countries, the blue countries, light and dark blue, are the ones where cancer is already the first or second cause of premature death. And you can see other countries will move into that category over time. And there are two perhaps distinct patterns. You know, in Japan, characteristic of a high-income country, already cancer is the number one cause of premature death. But if you take a country in Africa, South Africa in this case, you see still the importance of infectious and parasitic diseases and cardiovascular disease, of course. And that very much reflects the Human Development Index pattern globally. So we've got countries really in transition in terms of the patterns of cancer, the types of cancer, and the importance of cancer as a leading cause of premature death. I want to say a word or two about cancer registries, and then I'll finish with a short piece of my presentation about what we can do in response. I mean, the agency, along with many partners globally, has been trying to improve the basis on which we make these global estimates. So not just to collect information and make estimates, but to work alongside colleagues worldwide in conjunction with the International Association of Cancer Registries to improve the quality and coverage of registration. And there is some good news in this area. The blue-colored countries have high-quality population-based cancer registries, and the yellow countries are where we have now population-based registries that are improving in quality with technical support from IARC and others. If you stratify that by Human Development Index and ask where the high-quality registries are, I mean, it's still very much skewed to the wealthier nations. But the yellow bars where we have now population-based cancer registries is starting to spread. And I think this is an extremely positive indication. And the way we're doing this is through this global initiative for cancer registries. This is a partnership. I can't do justice to all the partners, but the logos are all there, who've driven this forward. And we're doing it by creating regional hubs of expertise in cancer registration, coordinated at a global level, but very much with country leadership and a regional focus. So this is a major step forward. What's a major failing is that in this huge financing of NCDs, cancer, cardiovascular disease, we struggle to find $15 million over 5 years for cancer registration, which would transform the basis on which ministries of health could make sensible investments in cancer control. I mean, this to me is an anomaly. And if you have any ideas, then please raise them in the panel or come to see me afterwards. So there's a lot of things we can do. You know, around half of cancers could be prevented if we applied the knowledge we have. That means translate the knowledge about causes into effective interventions. And there's actually a greater potential for interventions because we know that a lot more of those cancers have an environmental or lifestyle etiology. We need to adapt our interventions to national or regional situation. Let me give you 2 examples. This is the burden of cancers attributable to infections. So it's about 15% globally, but 1 in 3 cancers in parts of sub-Saharan Africa is linked to a chronic infection, whereas in Australia and New Zealand or North America, it's 1 in 30. So clearly the prioritization has to be different. If we do the same mapping exercise, and these data are also available on the Global Cancer Observatory, for high BMI, the picture is almost the inverse. Very strong contribution in those high-income countries and less in Southeast Asia and Africa. Now, these patterns are changing as well, but this is the picture at a point in time. I should stress the scales are different here as well. I want to say one word just about etiology. There's a lot of emphasis now on implementing interventions, but let's not forget that a large proportion of cancers, we still don't understand what causes them. So we have no foundation for prevention. And I've put a few of the leading cancers here for which I think we need more focus on understanding causes. So there are different ways of summarizing what can be done. I think this audience is well aware of a lot of this information, so I just extracted some of the WHO best buys and other recommended interventions and structured them by primary prevention. I mean, we don't need to rehearse those here, but particularly the HPV vaccination, I think, is something which is starting to reach the populations which need it. Secondary prevention for cervix, breast, colorectal, and oral cancer in high incidence regions. Mammography, though, is really only applicable if there's a well-developed health service. So one of the major challenges, I think, globally, given that the world is pink, is to find an alternative to mammography which can be applied to screening for breast cancer and early detection of breast cancer in low and middle income countries. And then there's a requirement for improved access, training, human resources in surgery, radiotherapy, chemotherapy, in order to perform some of these very effective treatments of early stage cancers, as well as the emphasis on palliative care, which is also a key part of this cancer control recommendations. There is also a very nice piece of work sponsored by the World Bank on disease control priorities for cancer, and again, I would encourage you to take a look at that essential cancer intervention package. The last general point I want to make is that prevention takes time and needs a long political commitment. These are just some examples of changes in cigarette consumption in South Africa and France over time, and also, sorry, in those two countries, but then in the US, projecting what's happened to lung cancer mortality rates as a follow-on from intervention against tobacco, and estimating the impact on the number of cancer cases. I mean, this took decades, but the benefits are seen. And you can make similar modeling, actually, for cervical cancer. This is a piece of work by Salvatore Vaccarella at the agency, just looking at the impact of introducing screening for cervical cancer into the Russian Federation, Latvia, and other Baltic countries. And again, here a more immediate impact on mortality. So we need political commitment and application of what we know. So my final slide to summarize. I mean, the global cancer burden is growing, and the greatest increases are in the low and middle HDI countries. We must recognize that patterns of cancer change over time with human development, and we need to build that into the planning and forward-looking for cancer control measures. A lot can be done now through prevention, early detection and treatment, even in the face of limited resources. And tailored cancer control measures are needed for regional and national priorities and must be subject to sustained commitment. And I hope this has given you a picture of where we stand with cancer, but also what can be done and to renew our efforts to promote this cancer control cause globally. Thank you very much for your attention.
So as I mentioned at the beginning, this is certainly from a UICC's perspective, Chris's formal swan song. And before we move on, I'd like to take this opportunity to reflect briefly on Chris's contribution to global cancer control, because as many of you know, Chris's tenure as the director of the International Agency on Research on Cancer is ending, having led the agency since January 2009. He's been a great and outstanding leader of the agency, an enormous supporter of UICC, and he has come to be respected across all of the cancer control community. It's appropriate, therefore, that we recognise this contribution. I'm sure Heather's going to be happy to have him back, but we would really like to recognise Chris's contribution. So if you could join me in just acknowledging Chris's contribution.
Well, I was not expecting this, but I appreciate it so much, actually, and particularly from amidst peers who contribute so much to cancer control. I mean, that's the inspiration, actually, for the people at the agency. I didn't write this either, so I had no say in what was said. But I appreciate the thought very much, and this will be something that will remain with me for a long time. Thank you so much.
Terrific, thank you all. So I'd now like to introduce Katie Dain, who is the CEO of the NCD Alliance and who was in New York last week for the high-level meeting. Katie's also a commissioner on the WHO Commission on NCDs, and she's going to be talking with us today about tackling NCDs by 2025, opportunities for integration of cancer control activities with the NCD agenda. Oh, we get music.
Thanks, Sanchia, and good morning, everybody. So a caveat before I start my presentation. The NCD Alliance has had its head deep into this process of the high-level meeting for about 18 months. And so when I was asked to present for 25 minutes on an 18-month experience, it was an interesting challenge. But let's see how we go with 25 minutes. So in terms of what I wanted to focus on this morning was four main areas. Firstly, to give you a bit of an overview of the high-level meeting itself, which happened just last week in New York. To give you an overview of the official deliberations that took place. But thirdly, also to give you a bit of an unofficial insider view into actually what was happening on the sidelines, which often at these UN meetings is as important as the official outcome itself. And then fourthly, to talk about what it means for the cancer community and the NCD community going forward. So firstly, in terms of the context for the high-level meeting, many of you will know that this was the third UN meeting on NCDs that we've had. The first took place in 2011 and was really a kind of landmark moment in the NCD response. First time that NCDs were discussed at that highest political level by world leaders. The second time we took NCDs to the UN was 2014. I would say overall a bit of a disappointment. Absolutely zero heads of government, heads of state in the room, and a pretty weak document that came out of it. So this one in September 2018 was our third bite at the cherry, as it were, in terms of really trying to raise political awareness and political commitments for our issues. And I know that there's often, naysayers around why are United Nations meetings and multilateral processes so important. And we really look at it in a few different ways. Firstly, because these UN meetings provide an opportunity to discuss global issues with every single country in one room. It also is an opportunity for getting our issue at the highest political level. Often NCDs and cancer are discussed at the World Health Assembly with ministers of health, which is important. But we all know that cancer and NCDs go well beyond health. And so this is the opportunity to get those issues to the highest political level. Also, obviously, the World Health Organization is the leading technical agency for health, and that needs to remain going forward. But we all know that cancer and NCDs are very much a political issue. So again, it's really an opportunity to take these issues to the political sphere. And also, it is an opportunity to make our governments focus on the issue, to reiterate commitments that have been made, and most importantly, to really chart a way forward in terms of next steps. And because we've been through 2 UN high-level meetings as the NCD Alliance and UICC, we've learnt a lot through those processes. We've got the scars for it and everything. And what we've learnt over the years is that the process is as important as the outcome. And so that's why when we set out to campaign for this high-level meeting, we as the NCD Alliance really wanted to make sure that, yes, we were focusing on outcome, but we were also focusing on important elements of the process. And that includes things like when the high-level meeting is set, and we worked very hard to try and get it in September, which it was in the end, rather than June, because that has a big impact on actually who's going to be there from governments. And also really using it as a chance to elevate the role of civil society in all of this. And as you all know, the actual meeting in September is the culmination of a very long process. And we've all worked very hard to ensure that civil society is a key part of all of those kind of feeder meetings into that big UN meeting that happened last week. So in terms of the context for this third high-level meeting, I wanted to mention a couple of positives about the backdrop to this high-level meeting, and then, unsurprisingly, a few negatives to this high-level meeting. When we went into this third meeting, we were very much aware of the fact that things had changed in global health and NCD since that first meeting back in 2011. We had seen a real rise in global awareness for the scale, the burden, the threat that Chris was just highlighting from a cancer perspective, and NCDs more broadly. Also, even though sometimes it's hard to see it, I think we have seen a real increase in the number of political leaders and champions that we've got behind the issue. Just one example of that is the fact that the WHO High-Level Commission on NCDs that was formed earlier this year includes 5 heads of government and heads of state who are chairing that commission. And I think back in 2011, we would have dreamt of having kind of, presidents and prime ministers really championing the issue. And we're beginning to see that happening. Thirdly, in terms of the context for this one is really important, is that obviously this comes at a time when there have been a huge number of plans, political commitments and targets that have already been set by governments. This isn't the first time they've come to the UN. They've already set the 25 by 25 targets. They've got the Global Action Plan for NCDs from WHO, and NCDs are included in the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's already that level of commitment, which is an important context for this one. Also, importantly, since the first high-level meeting, we've seen a real focus on the evidence base and consensus around what works. And again, Chris mentioned the WHO best buys, those 16 cost-effective interventions for prevention and control of NCDs that all governments, in a fairly fraught negotiation, agreed to and have consensus around. And so that is a different context from previous high-level meetings. And I think the final one, it's fair to say that we have a stronger civil society movement. Obviously, 2011, when we had that first high-level meeting, UICC only a couple of years ago had really given birth to the NCD Alliance, and it was a fairly new movement. Now, we're 10 years on, and we've really grown as a movement and working together across diseases and risk factors. And I think an example and a testament to that is the fact that WHO actually created a civil society working group for the high-level meeting in recognition of the importance of civil society and the fact that we had grown to know how to work together. So these are just a couple of the tried and tested solutions that I mentioned. The best buys, we've got many, many different technical packages now coming out of the World Health Organization, whether it's Empower on tobacco control, Shake on salt. The newest one is the Replace initiative on trans fats. all to say is that it's pretty clear of what governments need to be doing to reduce the burden of NCDs. And the other shift that we saw with this high-level meeting was that, we're not just talking about NCDs and cancer as a cost anymore. We're also talking about it as a smart and strategic long-term investment. And this is the new WHO report that came out just before the high-level meeting, country profiles. And what it shows is that, almost 10 million people, premature deaths from NCDs could be avoided by 2025 if governments implemented the best buys. And for every $1 that they invest in best buys, they're going to get a return of $7. So these are important contexts for the high-level meeting. The fact that we've got the proven solutions and we can see NCDs being an investment, this is different from the previous high-level meetings. So that's on the positive side. Unsurprisingly, there are a fair amount of negatives. And Chris painted a very good picture of the challenges on the slow, uneven progress from the cancer perspective. But we're seeing this across the board in NCDs, really slow, uneven progress nationally in implementing commitments and making progress towards the targets of 25 by 25. Also, we've really seen the fact that countries are overwhelmed and paralysed. Even though there's the cost-effective interventions, they don't know where to start with very, very limited resources. Most importantly, I think, for this high-level meeting, what we saw is a huge amount of political inertia around NCDs. The amount of times we heard governments saying, we've been to the UN already twice before, why do we need to go back? And the fact that there was a real resistance to anything proposed in the political declaration, which is the formal outcome of the high-level meeting, being in any way new or ambitious. So the political environment, I think, for this high-level meeting was perhaps the hardest that we've been navigating since the previous two. And fourthly, as we've all been talking about for many years, still really pitiful levels of resources. As well as, and I'll touch upon these in a minute, really strong interference from the powerful multinationals in public policy, particularly big tobacco, big alcohol, big food. I think the one promising thing there is the fact that they actually saw the UN high-level meeting as a threat, which I think tells us that it is going to make a difference and it's important. But that's not to sway away from the fact that we were up against some really big interests when we're talking about NCDs at the UN. So just to touch upon a couple of those briefly, the slow and uneven progress. The UN Secretary General at the end of last year, which really kick-started this process for the high-level meeting, said, the world has yet to fulfill its promise in implementing measures to reduce risk of premature deaths from NCDs. Political commitments have often not been translated into concrete action, i.e. fine words have been said, but very little action on the ground. And many of you might have seen our new paper that we published just before the high-level meeting, which is a new initiative called NCD Countdown 2030. And what that paper shows is that more than half of all countries are projected to miss the premature mortality target by 2030. And I think even more concerningly in that paper, it shows that actually a handful of countries are stagnating, if not going backwards, including high-income countries like where we were for the United Nations meeting last week, the US. And underneath this, what we also know is that if you look at it from a policy indicator perspective, we know that only around a half of countries have national NCD plans in place. And that really tells us that they don't even have the foundational building blocks in place to drive the response. And the same is the case for the national cancer control plans, with a very, very few percentage of cancer control plans being fully costed, which is still a real challenge. So this is the big kind of story behind where we were going with the high-level meeting. Governments are well off track, and we've got really, really anemic levels of financing. What this graph shows is on the right-hand side, the disease burden, where you can see in red NCDs being the largest proportion of disease. And on the left, you've got the development assistance for health, and you can barely even see the red line, which is development assistance for health for non-communicable disease. So less than 2% of development assistance for health going to NCDs, despite the fact that this is the #1 killer, the largest contributor to morbidity worldwide. And then, as I mentioned, the multinational interests, food companies, big tobacco, big alcohol, really coming into play with these UN meetings. And we've seen it time and time again, and we very much saw it this time round. It was an interesting experience to be in New York actually in June when we were going around a lot of the government missions talking about our priorities for the UN high-level meeting and what they should really be focusing on, doing what civil society should be doing. And it was quite ironic by the fact that many of them said, oh, it's interesting that you're coming round this week. We've actually just been having Heineken around the table as well as AB and Bev, and they've literally been doing the rounds exactly like you are. So this is the kind of thing that we're up against, and we've seen time and time again during these negotiations for the high-level meeting very similar tactics that we're all very familiar with, really subverting and confusing around the evidence, using front groups to confuse, as well as obviously the huge budgets that they have behind them in terms of their lobbying tactics. So as Alona Kickbush says, you know, nowhere in public health are the interrelationships between the political and commercial determinants of health more evident than with NCDs, and we've certainly seen that with the high-level meeting. So let me just give you a quick overview of what happened officially at the high-level meeting. Obviously, one of the big focuses for us was trying to get heads of government, heads of state in the room to talk about NCDs. In the end, what we managed was 23 heads of government and heads of state were there, as well as 55 ministers of health. Now, this is an improvement from 2014, where I mentioned there was absolutely no heads of government and heads of state in the room. Not quite what we managed in 2011, where we had 34 heads of state. But still, I think it's a sign that there is still that political appetite and political interest in NCDs. And actually what we heard was that there was even more governments wanted to make a statement, but actually the sheer fact that the meeting was only one day was actually a hindrance to having more heads of government speak. Whether that's true or not, I'm not entirely sure. But we got heads of government and heads of state in the room, which is the most important thing. And actually, as a result of that, what we saw during the opening of the high-level meeting was WHO DG Tedros proposing, not committing to anything, but proposing that we could create a presidential coalition for NCDs with 6 to 12 heads of state and government who would then go forward and champion the issue of NCDs. Again, we would have only have dreamt of this in 2011, so I think it is a sign that things are moving in terms of political awareness on the issue. In terms of actually what went down during the day, I think for many actually when you actually get finally to the UN, in a way it's a little bit of an anticlimax. You've been working for these things for so long, and then you end up sitting in a room with a lot of very long statements from governments. But the way that the day was split up was that you had an opening ceremony where our very own Princess Dina Mered was opening and really gave a rallying call to governments and did a fantastic job of representing the community. And then we had a number of plenary sessions, which was where governments made their statements. And in parallel, you had a number of roundtables. Again, many government statements, but that's the nature of the UN and what the whole purpose was about. A number of really important speakers as well, such as Michael Bloomberg, whose term as WHO NCD ambassador has been continued for another 2 years. That was another announcement during the week. And I think what we did see over the day was just who the champions are for NCDs. And I have to really call out the president of Uruguay as one of those that we're all familiar with, Dr. Tabere Vasquez. Uruguay was one of the co-facilitators of this whole process, and his leadership in the issue has become crystal clear throughout these last 18 months, if not before. Now, this was the formal outcome of the high-level meeting, as it were. And just to give you an idea of how these things are negotiated, these are negotiated well in advance of September the 27th when they all arrive. It's negotiated by the missions in New York, and it took about 2.5 months to get to a point where all governments agreed to this political declaration. And as I've mentioned before, this is really the third political declaration that we've had. And it was a very, very challenging, I would say, negotiation. I think the co-facilitators had hoped to get it wrapped up a lot quicker than was possible. And we've seen all sorts of different arguments and positions from governments at play, including a resounding one from many of them that they really didn't want to repeat what had already been agreed in previous declarations. And as I mentioned before, the other resounding message that we heard from governments was a real lack of appetite to really go for something bold and ambitious. And as many of you know, the high-level commission that Sanchia was chairing, the whole idea of that was to really try and set the bar high for the high-level meeting. And some of those recommendations made it into the declaration, but I would say it was a very challenging political environment. Just to give you a kind of snapshot of the good, the bad and the ugly of the political declaration. In terms of the good, that there are some new commitments in there. The WHO claimed that there are 13 new commitments in there for governments to be taking forward. I think one of the really big pieces of news from this declaration is that we move from a 4x4 agenda to a 5x5 agenda with mental health and air pollution now included in our agenda. I think one of the good news stories for this declaration is that the involvement of civil society and people living with NCDs is recognised really for the first time, which again is an important part. And there is a partial focus on accountability, but in our view, not enough. In terms of the bad, there's a real failure to mention the comorbidities for NCDs, despite the fact that we've had that in previous political declarations. I think one of the big pieces in terms of the bad news is that there are no new time-bound national commitments for governments to be taking forward, which make it very, very difficult for us to be holding them to account, which is obviously what they were after. In terms of financing, again, the picture is fairly depressing in the sense that we're not moving forward with this declaration in terms of the official language anyway. It's very much a copy and paste job from previous declarations. And I think in terms of the focus on the private sector, what we see is that there's no real new call to action on the private sector and a very weak focus on the importance of conflict of interest, managing conflict of interest in terms of public-private partnerships. And I'd say one of the worst parts of the political declaration, if we're going to get really depressed, is the fact that the next high-level meeting will take place in 2025. That's 7 years from now, a very, very long time away. And up till now, we've had a 3 or 4 year gap between them, which has been ideal. Governments have time to actually implement and make progress on the ground. Then we come back to the UN to review. This way, we're actually meeting the next time, 2025, when those 2025 targets are actually due. So let's hope that governments can really kickstart and get a move on by the time we actually get there. And I think the real ugly part of the political declaration negotiations this time around has been actually an attempt by some governments to chip away at those best buys that governments had already agreed to. Really trying to chip away at the cost-effective interventions, the solutions that we know are tried and tested and are evidence-based, as well as a real lack of focus on fiscal policies, particularly sugar-sweetened beverage taxation immediately being removed by certain governments around the table. In terms of perhaps the more juicy, interesting parts of the unofficial takeaways from the week, and I'd say that these aren't just from the week, they're from the whole process, because as we always say, the process is as important as the outcome. As I've already mentioned, I think one of the big takeaways is this, that we are moving from the 4 diseases, 4 risk factors, to now having mental health conditions as the 5th disease, which has obviously been a really marginalised part of the agenda, as well as the inclusion of air pollution as a risk factor, which is obviously so important for cancer, particularly lung cancer. So a really welcome addition to the agenda from our perspective. Also, I think so important that we've seen throughout this process a real palpable political leadership on cancer specifically. And I think the 2 issues that have been at the forefront is, I think Chris just mentioned earlier, the announcement of the WHO St. Jude's collaboration on childhood cancer and the injection of a $15 million investment in that initiative is obviously very, very welcome, and I think should really be seen as an opportunity to support health system strengthening for cancer more broadly and NCDs as a whole. And then the other area that has really had a lot of focus has been cervical cancer. And obviously this started at the World Health Assembly when Dr. Tedros made that announcement of calling for elimination. And he's been joined since then by UNAIDS, by UNITAID, by the Global Fund, by Gavi, really joining forces. And I think what we saw at the high-level meeting was real political leadership from some of the countries with the greatest burden like Zambia, and Burkina Faso, who are really kind of taking the lead. So really good to see kind of political leadership on specific areas of the cancer agenda, but obviously we need to be using them as a way of pathfinders for the broader issues. The other takeaway from our perspective is that we really feel that this high-level meeting has resulted in taking alcohol control out of the shadows. I think this has been one of the marginalised risk factors for many years, in a sense, a kind of Cinderella issue of NCDs. And what we saw at the high-level meeting was the launch of a new technical package by WHO on alcohol control called SAFER, as well as the launch of the Global Status Report on Alcohol and Health, and we put out a policy brief on alcohol control as well. So it really, and actually at the meeting itself, a number of governments were calling for a framework convention on alcohol control at the highest political level, including the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka. So really good to be seeing this momentum on an issue that I think has been marginalised for many years. Another important moment during the week, which is of huge relevance to the cancer community, is this real movement to divest from tobacco. And obviously the work of Dr. Bronwyn King and tobacco-free portfolios has really led this initiative, but an important event during that week where the tobacco-free finance pledge was launched with a number of different pension funds, banks, institutions. I think there's 130 signatories now who've signed up to this tobacco-free finance pledge. So really good momentum on this issue as well. Also, what we saw during the week was just the importance of the cancer and NCD community not remaining in our own silo and linking very strongly with this huge political capital around universal health coverage. Dr. Tedros often says all roads lead to universal health coverage, and he's been joined by Jim Kim from the World Bank, who is really linking the issue with their particular interest around human capital. If we invest in people, we're going to see development and an economic growth follow. And obviously, we all know that next year, next September, we'll see the first UN high-level meeting on universal health coverage. So a really good opportunity for us to be building synergies with the UHC movement as a whole. I think the other takeaway that we've had from our side is that civil society has not been so civil. We've heard this time and time again that we're far too polite as a movement. Where's the outrage in cancer and NCDs? And obviously the NCD Alliance is just one partner in this broader picture. But, you know, we use this opportunity to really kind of draw a line in the sand with governments and say, you know, we've had enough of the political inaction and political inertia around the issue. And that was really our campaign for the high-level meeting around this Enough campaign. So I think we began to see hopefully a longer-term shift in being more strident from the civil society perspective on NCDs. I've mentioned this already, but I think it's just important to highlight that these kind of meetings do really unearth as Ilona says, the commercial determinants were out in force. Just a couple of examples of how they transpired during the week. I was very honoured to be invited to a side event inside the UN hosted by the Dominican Republic, as well as the Worldwide Brewing Alliance, and Heineken and AB InBev and many others, and we politely declined. But the fact that they're actually holding side events inside the UN and positioning themselves as partners to sustainable development and health is obviously just one of the many tactics that the alcohol industry is using, and it obviously comes out very prominently during those kind of weeks. You might have seen the excellent tweet by PMI after the high-level meeting of congratulating UNGA on the high-level meeting and to work with the private sector to fight NCDs. We are ready and determined to contribute to beat NCDs. And actually the picture at the bottom is a side event organised by a business coalition which included PMI in their panel, despite the fact that they were talking about sustainable development. And then the other example, which you'll probably all have been aware of, is the fact that, you know, we see the private sector and particularly the unhealthy commodity industries using governments to promote their messages. And obviously that came out very clearly in the high-level commission that put out its report in the 1st of June, where we saw the US completely torpedoing any mention of sugar-sweetened beverage taxes in that report, and that continued throughout in the political declaration negotiations. So extremely difficult. I think I mentioned earlier the constant challenge that we have around financing, and I think this high-level meeting hasn't solved the issue at all. Financing, no doubt, remains really the Achilles heel of the NCD response. What we saw during the week was a few announcements around financing. For example, we had the Minister of Health of Russia announced a $1 million contribution to the UN Interagency Task Force on NCDs. We had the President of Kenya calling for a catalytic global fund on NCDs. And these are obviously very welcome, but in all honesty, $1 million from a country is going to really not solve the issue. And just to kind of put it in contrast, what we did see is, the Norwegian government committing 360 million to the Global Financing Facility for Women and Children's Health, as well as the Netherlands investing $68 million into Global Financing Facility. And this is not to say that the financing facility in women and children's health isn't important. It's just to say that obviously we're not seeing the investment that we need in cancer and non-communicable diseases. And then I'm drawing to a close. Finally, what we're seeing is a real missing link, is accountability. And I've mentioned the 2025 date being a real challenge for the next high-level meeting. And I think Michael Bloomberg put it quite nicely. He said, who set the date of the 2025 high-level meeting? 7 years from now, what on earth were you thinking while people are dying? But it also draws a broader point around accountability and the fact that what we've got at the moment in terms of the accountability framework and mechanism is very much broken. Because what we see is governments going to the UN and making very self-congratulatory statements. They miss all of the targets and indicators that have been set, and there's no way of reviewing and reprimanding what has happened. So that's why we as NCDA have been very keen to push this concept of independent accountability, which is a way of, civil society, academic experts really providing a critical review of actually what's happening on the ground. So just to close in terms of implications and next steps, I think as I've highlighted already, that we see the high-level meeting as much as a journey, the journey is as important as the outcome. And I think it's fair to say that what this high-level meeting has done is really been a catalyst for new data, for putting solutions on the table, for really unearthing who, in a way, the political leaders and laggards are out there. And also really putting a spotlight on the issue and raising political awareness. So I think we need to really focus on the fact that this is the process as much as the outcome. But as also we've all been saying, the high-level meeting is not a cliff edge. On Friday the 28th, after 18 months of work, we didn't put our feet up and say, whew, thank goodness for that. Obviously, our work really starts now, and it's obviously up to all of us to be ensuring that we really keep the momentum going and hold our government's feet to the fire on the commitments that they've made. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And if I could now ask our two panellists to come forward. So we have Laura Suchil, who is the Director for Strategic Programs at the National Cancer Institute of Mexico, and Todd Harper, who is the CEO of Cancer Council Victoria, but also on the NCD Alliance board. So welcome to you both. Okay, so Laura, if I could start with you, have you got any reflections on those presentations from a Mexican perspective?
Thank you. Yes, of course. I was overwhelmed with all the information they have presented. I'm very happy with the information Katie gave us about the high-level meeting. But I was thinking, how Mexico is going to do that? Well, we have all these people working in high-level meetings, and there are many proposals and solutions and analysis, but how a middle-income country with many constraints, with the 80% of mortality due to non-communicable diseases and mental diseases, and not interested in health and with not a political agenda, how to do that? So,
big problem.
Big problem.
Todd, what about you?
Thank you, Sanchia, and thank you also to the wonderful presentations. I thought I'd pick up where Katie left off and talking about the ugly. and particularly the lack of focus that was on the best buys. Ugly is one description. I think outrageous would be another description. What we're talking about here is the removal of recognition of interventions which not only save lives and reduce morbidity, but they're also good value for money. So for me, the motivation to remove or not include best buys in NCD prevention is really outrageous. But I suppose I really would like to focus on the positives that come out of it. What it does, I think, is confirm in a way that we haven't seen before the absolute importance of the economic arguments around prevention of NCDs, prevention of cancer. We saw that if the commercial determinants of health and those from the industries that create so much harm in our community, if it means so much to them to not have that recognised, imagine how powerful it will be to our cause. So it might be worth reflecting that when we talk about best buys, the things that come out top in best buys in economic evaluation are often taxation measures and they're often regulatory measures, things like bans on tobacco advertising. The reason that there's such good value for money is two reasons. One, they work, and secondly, they require very little in the way of investments from government. Governments introduce those policies, there's a small upfront cost, but then the benefits are sustained into future years. Now, I think this gives us insight into where we need to take the arguments in the future. We're going to be facing, as an NCD community, a growing gap between the affordability of NCD care, cancer care and treatment into the future. We're going to need to be able to help governments to close that gap, and investing in those best buys is going to be one of the best ways to help governments achieve that. And things like taxation measures on alcohol, sugary beverages, tobacco is going to be absolutely critical and would be a best value buy. And then we can use those funds to fund and reduce that gap that we have at the moment in effective prevention, screening, treatment for NCDs. So while I started by saying I was outraged by that exclusion, I think it shows that that's the path that we need to take. There's a vacuum there from some of our political leaders, there's a vacuum there from some of the private industry, but we need to fill that gap.
Thanks, Todd. And I think you've touched a little bit on my question for the panel, and that is, reflecting Dr. Princess Nono's impatience yesterday, and also some impatience that's been voiced in Australia by Andrew Forrest, who's the funder of the Eliminate Cancer Foundation. He says, you cancer people, you're just too patient. You've lived for too long with the glacial speed of progress, and that we need to be more impatient. So given that impatience, what do we think, panel, are the biggest priorities? And Chris, maybe I'll start with you, that we need to really argue for tomorrow. We know that we've got all the things from the high-level meeting and from the cancer resolution, but if you had to do something tomorrow, what would it be? You might need to grab that microphone. There's one between two, and I'm not allowed to share mine, apparently.
Well, you just signed off my career, so I don't have to do anything tomorrow. That's but you know, maybe I can just also dwell a little bit on this industry influence, because, and an anecdote for you. So the first of these sort of high-level meetings I went to was, I think it was a ministerial conference in Moscow on NCDs back in 2010, probably. I'd never been exposed to this before. So we spent about 6 months crafting a perfect scientific evidence-based document to support the sorts of interventions that are now being spoken about. And in 48 hours, I saw it transformed in side meetings and discussions among subgroups and so on and so forth. And what it brought home to me is that there isn't a real distinction between the private sector and the government. I mean, often the government is representing views that have been put by the industries that are important in that country. So we have to recognize that there's a continuum there. I mean, I hadn't fully appreciated that. And so putting, as Todd said, the emphasis on the economic arguments, the benefits of investment, I think is crucial. And we're doing better at that, at bringing that component into the arguments. But I think we also have to evaluate the models as well. We don't have that many examples where we can demonstrate the positive benefit of those investment arguments having been implemented. So that's one thing I would like to see more of. What would I do tomorrow? Well, clearly, I think because cancer's becoming the predominant NCD in many countries, I think using the numbers to demonstrate both the health burden but also the economic cost and the impact that's going to have on the sustainability of health services for governments can keep the pressure on and making that more public. And the other is to tackle some of the gaps in knowledge. And there are two that I would point to, one which has resonance across the whole NCD agenda. I mean, obesity and overweight, there are recommendations on physical inactivity and so, but we have very little demonstration of what actually works, at school level or in adults. To me, this is a huge gap. I mean, if you asked me what I would do at the moment, it's here that the politics is running ahead of the science, actually. So I'd put a lot of emphasis on trying to demonstrate effective interventions against that epidemic. That would be one. And the second one would be on breast cancer, and early detection and access to treatment. I mean, this is a major challenge. And cervical cancer is fantastic, but the second one would be what are the alternatives to mammography-based screening in low and middle income countries, and how do we bring, therefore, access to timely treatment for women in those regions?
Katie?
I think I'd say three things, really. Leadership, financing, and accountability being the top three for me. I mean, I think, as I said in my presentation, the fact that we've now got a 7-year wait to the next UN meeting, we really need to kind of ensure that all of the work that we've been doing over the last 18 months, 2 years in the lead up to this high-level meeting isn't lost. And so really trying to keep and maintain and cultivate that group of champions for cancer. And it's not just about prime ministers and presidents, it's about first ladies, it's about community level champions. It's really focusing on, building out that group so that when we next get to the UN, we can really see a difference. And I'd also add, for better or worse, the power of celebrity when we're talking about champions. When you look at the number of celebrities and ambassadors that UNAIDS has for HIV/AIDS, in cancer and NCDs, we just don't have them. And that's what really kind of speaks to people about the issue. And then in terms of financing, one thing I would add is, I think we all do a good job at making the case for our issue to ministers of health. But I do wonder how many of us are actually talking to our ministers of finance. And as we all know, they're the ones that hold the purse strings and really control the budget. And they talk a completely different language from us public health people. So the more that we can be focusing on ministries of finance and using their language around fiscal space and all the other different ways that are described from a finance perspective, I think the better. And then I'd say the final one around accountability, just that, civil society has a really important role in actually tracking progress on NCDs, and there's loads of different examples of how civil society is doing this, whether it's benchmarking their government's progress against the targets, as was done recently in Australia, or whether it's shadow reporting, or whether it's citizens' juries. We can do a lot to actually hold our government's feet to the fire, so I think the more that we can be doing that, the better.
How much harder is it to hold government's feet to the fire when you're actually funded by government, Laura? Is that more difficult in Mexico?
Yes, it is, but it's possible. we have the experience with the National Cancer Plan and the registry that if we want to talk with them, they are not too open, but if we develop some strategies with the civil society, talking to politicians and other members of the government, not only the Ministry of Health, other government actors, and of course with the other support like international support, we can talk to them. We want to put in the agenda health as a priority, and we think we can do it.
So Todd, a couple of weeks ago you actually had the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Health in the room talking about this. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so this was an opportunity to bring together leaders in Treasury and in health. And one of the things that I think I've always been surprised about is that the language is different between the two bureaucracies, and it isn't often easy for them to find that common language on which to communicate. So this was certainly the goal of the meeting that you were describing, looking at providing a resource of cost-effective, value-for-money interventions, and clearly bringing them together. There is a real skill to it, and I think we shouldn't assume that it's a ready conversation or an easy conversation between the two. So I think civil society has a way to bring those together. I think, and finally, if I can, in terms of the economics, 2 points that I would make. One that we don't tend to emphasise very much is the fact that 40% of NCDs deaths are premature. They're occurring in people who are at the productive prime in their working lives. So this has significant impact on economies, the loss of that productive capacity. So that economic argument may be another one that we can exploit. And picking up on Katie's excellent suggestion, I think one of the things that we can do, we are organisations that are day-to-day running programs, implementing policies. The way that we can, I think, help to advance the argument is to identify ways to conduct economic evaluations of those interventions and share them and advocate for them globally, because we know that if one intervention works well in one country, more than likely it's going to work well in another country. So we could be actually continuing to give voice and focus to best buys. It may not be in the resolution from the high-level meeting, but it can be part of our narrative and our discussion going forward.
Terrific. I am going to open up in a couple of minutes, so if people have got questions, please make your way to one of the microphones that are in each of the aisles. So if we can just go to the political or the interference, the industry interference question, and Katie's outlined that quite well, I think, in terms of some of the ways the food and beverage industry and the alcohol industry are taking the lead from big tobacco's previous interference. But I wonder whether the interference in civil society is also an issue. There was an article that Terry Slevin sent me a couple of weeks, or about a month ago, around an analysis of food and beverage industry presence on boards and funding mechanisms for civil society organisations in heart and diabetes. I won't name the country. You can look up the reference, it's published. But is this something that we also need to be really careful about? Is it any of the panel want to react to that? Maybe Katie?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's been lots of research done on the fact that obviously one of the tactics of big tobacco for years and now big food and big alcohol is funding civil society groups and creating almost kind of front groups for the issues. And you know, I think Heineken and AB InBev AB InBev particularly created a foundation a couple of years ago, and also created an initiative called Smart Drinking Goals, which was cleverly the same acronym of as the SDGs, and then started ploughing a huge amount of funds into civil society organisations in low and middle income countries to be doing awareness raising around responsible drinking. So that's just one example of how these things pan out. So it's certainly something that we need to be really focusing on.
So it looks as if it's a positive, but it's actually an undermining of our cause. Mohammed?
Yeah, I'm Mohamed Hari from Casablanca, Morocco. I would like just to mention that all at what I am seeing now with these high-level meetings, I don't see how this can impact my practice in my country, and it seems almost hopeless. I don't really, I don't think that's the way to have impact. It's too general, too generic. We are speaking too theory and nothing going to the practice. Even the term NCD is too generic. It's diluting everything, and even those who are asking for, help, they are different. People working in cardiovascular are different from those who are arguing for cancer, and with this, people who are in the decision maker, they don't see how, in practice, they can do something in the field. It's too much, too generic, and not focused. The one thing that I see, the model that I see that may work is the one that started with St. Jude and WHO. This is very focused. There is a program and there is a model. And I think we have to think about some models that can be extended to other diseases or group of diseases. That's the way I think we have to approach. Thank you.
So, given Todd and Katie were at the meeting, do you want to focus on really what are the tangible things that matter?
So I think it's easy to understand that comment because they're conversations that happen in quarters that often we're not exposed to. Industry certainly is, but we're not often exposed to those types of arguments. So I would respectfully disagree in that what we've seen over the past couple of years is the highest levels of government having conversations about NCDs. So if that UN General Assembly meeting hadn't been held, those conversations wouldn't have been held. It wouldn't have required foreign ministers, heads of state, health ministers to be engaging with civil society in their own countries, departments in their own countries around their attitudes, views in relation to NCDs and NCD prevention. So I had the experience of participating in one of those discussions around cervical cancer, and to have that issue on the agenda of this particular government was very powerful. Now that isn't a meeting that's going to end up in a press release. It's not the type of outcome that will be spoken about generally at these meetings, but it does spark conversation, and sometimes it does spark commitment, though I do acknowledge that what we saw out of the meeting wasn't the outcome that we would have wanted. But to pick up on Katie's point, the process has been incredibly important, and forcing all of those countries to have conversations with their health leaders within government around their commitments to NCDs.
So it's a part of building momentum, but what we're wanting to really think about is how do we accelerate that momentum? Chris?
I mean, just very briefly to add, I understand the point that was made, but I think we're dealing with different things. So one is the political awareness at the high level. So if I can give an example with the registries, just the fact that those targets that I mentioned in my talk are in there. You know, for years we've had the enthusiasm on the ground to create registries among our colleagues, but now those colleagues can go to the ministry officials and say, look, this is one of the things that's committed to. So I think what we have to do is take the practical measures that are amongst the best buys and other things like that, and use the fact that they've been approved at a high level to drive them into practice. So I think the two things do come together, but I wouldn't underestimate the value of having this on the highest political agenda.
And it's got us all singing from the same hymn sheet. It's David, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes, David Makuni.
Thank you. My name is David Makumi. I'm the chairman of the Kenya Network of Cancer Organizations, which is the network, the umbrella body for cancer civil society in Kenya. Thank you to the excellent presenters and the wonderful panelists. Just two comments, and not specific to any one of you, so I'll not put anyone on the spot. The data that was presented is excellent, and it may just remain data, just like you'd see a big newspaper headline that there will be 10 million new cancer cases every year, and we go like, oh my God. And after 3 days, that gets forgotten. And for civil society, I think part of the work that civil society needs to be strengthened on is to break that data to moral arguments, because our politicians will not understand pie charts and all those things. They probably understand something like 113 Kenyans are diagnosed with cancer every day. You know, some of those moral arguments, and given that it is 7 years to the next high-level meeting, governments will have changed, there will be new ministry officials and so on, and country priorities may change. But if we keep the moral arguments and break it down, maybe a way of packaging that message for civil society and to the citizen. And that also goes to the presentation from Katie around the resolutions. I mean, sometimes these resolutions are made, but the language is not broken down to galvanize citizens and civil society to get angry enough to hold their governments to accountable. And there would be a necessity to have an accountability framework or mechanism that, for example, we would use in low and middle income countries to hold governments to certain standards. So breaking down all these to the ordinary citizen on the streets and civil society so that we are able to call out our governments. And it's not easy. And just a quick comment on this industry interference, especially in weak economies in our countries where the Minister of Finance is looking at the tax and whatever this industry brings on board. So it's much more complex, and it's not an area that civil society can fight alone, because the government expects, the exchequer expects money from them, so it's an area we may need a new front to fight this one. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Important comments. Mary, question?
Right. So I have a question to Katie. Cancer is, as Chris alluded to and many others, a very complicated set of very many diverse diseases that use a lot of health care system resources. Considering how long it took you for NCD Alliance to be at the table, to develop, to be more inclusive, to respond to the needs of civil society, do you think it is time to start the civil society movement to strengthen health systems rather than just NCDs or just infections or just cancer? Because we know it's going to take a decade or two. So your thoughts would be appreciated.
Just to quickly respond to David and then Mary as well. I mean, David, I completely agree with you, and I think you know, it's no surprise that these political declarations, that the language is extremely dry and very, very. It's definitely not going to inspire people to take to the streets. That's for sure. So, as you say, it's really civil society's role to be kind of unpacking the data that, you know, Chris obviously was presenting on, but also unpacking what it means for our governments on the ground. And actually kind of really trying to show to governments what they need to be doing to take forward the political declaration. So I think that's a really, really good point. In terms of Mary's question around civil society and the need for a stronger civil society movement around health system strengthening rather than focusing on our silos, I agree, and I think it's actually happening because obviously, as I mentioned, the next September there's a UN high-level meeting on universal health coverage, and there's a new movement that has been born called UHC 2030, which is essentially a kind of movement of governments and civil society organisations really focusing on UHC and exactly what you were describing. But I think it's also important because I think the challenge with getting people excited about health system strengthening and UHC is that it can very quickly become this bottomless pit of unspecifics. So I kind of really believe that you need to continue to have the disease silo communities to be pushing our own specific issues. Obviously, UICC focusing on cancer as well as working with the broader NCDA family on NCDs. But we all need to continue to be doing that, but be linking into this broader civil society movement around universal health coverage, because the worst outcome next September would be that NCDs and cancer are forgotten out of this broader picture of universal health coverage and health system strengthening.
And on that note, which I think is a perfect note, please join me in thanking our panel and join them.